I never imagined the day would come when I'd feel like a ghost at my own family's gathering. I used to be the one who built the tables, who paid for the chairs, who carved the turkey and lifted the toasts. I wasn't the loudest in the room, never the one who demanded attention, but my presence meant something. Or at least it used to. Time, I've learned, has a way of making you invisible without ever announcing its plan. It doesn't arrive with a trumpet or a clock chime. It simply happens, slowly, until one day someone you helped raise looks you in the eye and tells you, with a casual cruelty you never thought possible, that you no longer belong. It started on a Saturday morning, the kind where the sun slips lazily through the windows and the coffee tastes more nostalgic than energizing. I was sitting at the kitchen table, watching the house stir with activity. My daughter-in-law, Vanessa, was giving orders like a general preparing for war. The catering team needs to lay out by noon. She snapped into her phone, pacing the floor in high heels and an overpriced dress shirt that still had the boutique tag hanging off the back. She was meticulous, driven, always reaching for some idea of perfection she never defined out loud but seemed to believe she could buy. Her events were her life staged smiles, wide napkins, filtered photos, and flattering captions written like declarations of royalty. This one was for her birthday, though she insisted on calling it a brand celebration, whatever that meant. I watched in silence as she breezed through the room, barely acknowledging anyone who wasn't holding a clipboard or a Bluetooth headset. My son, Aaron, stood near the doorway, nodding meekly, avoiding my gaze. He'd become quieter over the years, molded slowly by the force of Vanessa's voice and ambitions. They had planned a grand gathering, that much I knew, over 100 guests, a DJ, cocktail fountains, customized gift bags. I hadn't been officially invited, but I lived in the same house, so I assumed there'd be a seat somewhere, maybe near the back. I never expected to be celebrated, just included. After all, I had helped them buy this very house. When the down payment had fallen short, I wrote the check without hesitation. "It's your time now," I had said, back when I still believed in legacy. That morning, Vanessa stood at the dining room entrance, reviewing floral arrangements on her iPad. When she turned and noticed me, for a moment, she hesitated, like someone spotting an error in a photograph. Then, with a forced smile and a tone as breezy as it was lethal, she said, "Just so you know, the party's not really for old people, okay?" Her words floated into the room like ash, soft and slow, but they burned all the same. She didn't say it in anger. That would have been easier to process. No, she said it with a kind of dismissive finality, reserved for expired coupons and leftovers you get to eat. A polite ejection, a velvet-gloved shove. My heart didn't break, it froze. And in that moment, no one spoke. Aaron looked down at his phone. One of the assistants giggled. I stood up without a word, feeling my knees protest more from shame than age, and walked toward the front door. The hallway seemed longer than usual. The walls felt narrower. The air had the texture of glass, fragile and dangerous. I stepped out into the sunlight, the weight of her words still ringing in my ears. Not for old people, not for me. I walked slowly down the path, my shoes crunching against the gravel I once helped lay. The flowers in the garden I had planted were in full bloom, yet I didn't stop to admire them. I had seen enough. In all my years, I had endured a lot, illness, layoffs, the funeral of my wife, but this was something else. This was erasure, performed in daylight and cloaked in a smile. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I simply returned to my small studio in the guest house out back, the one they offered me when my health declined and my independence wavered. It had been pitched as a kind gesture, a place of your own, but close to family. Lately, it felt more like a holding cell made of gratitude. I closed the door, poured myself a glass of water, and sat in the armchair near the window, From there, I could still see the main house, could still hear the faint noise of preparations. But something had shifted. Something deep. A thread had been cut, and though I didn't know it yet, in that silence, something else had begun to sew itself back together. I picked up the leather folder on my desk, the one where I kept old receipts, property titles, dusty warranties. It was more habit than intention at first, just my way of grounding myself when the world outside turned sour. But then, as I flipped through the pages, my fingers brushed against something familiar. A copy of a contract. The name of the event venue. A deed I had signed years ago, before Aaron and Vanessa were even married. I squinted at the header. The name was still mine. The realization didn't come with fire or fury. It came like a calm tide. I leaned back in the chair, feeling the weight of memory settle around me. I hadn't thought about that place in a long time. It had been one of my earlier investments, made when I still wore a suit to work and spoke in numbers. I had leased it out years ago to a local event company but never sold the property. It was mine. And when I checked the date on the current lease agreement, I saw something curious. The contract allowed the sole owner, to override any scheduled event, with or without explanation, so long as notice was given before a 24-hour deadline. My fingers hovered over the phone. I didn't make the call, not yet. I simply placed the folder on the table, stared at it for a long while, and took a deep breath. The sun outside had started to dip, casting long shadows over the lawn. The house was still buzzing with energy, Vanessa's voice rising every now and then in exclamations and instructions. But something had already shifted inside me. I wasn't going to be erased. I wasn't going to beg for a seat at a table I built. I wasn't angry, not in the way people expect. I was focused, precise. The kind of calm that made men dangerous. She thought this party was hers. She had no idea whose ground she was standing on. And that silence I left her with, that was just the first warning bell. The thing about people like Vanessa is that they never look down. They live suspended in a world built from invitations and illusions, floating on the assumption that everything beneath them is stable, silent, and theirs to command. They step on names, faces, even memories, and expect no echo from the ground they press. That night, as I sat watching the dim glow of the main house through the window of my guest quarters, the glow of lanterns and floodlights beginning to spill into the night, I realized something strange. Not once in the last few years had Vanessa ever asked who actually owned the venue she loved so much. She assumed, I suppose, that Aaron had paid for it, or that it was some gift, a transaction forgotten in the fog of time. She never asked because she never believed she needed to. But my full name was still the one carved on the dotted line. The contract for the venue hadn't changed hands. I had kept it, out of sentiment, perhaps, or maybe, subconsciously, I had known I might need it one day. I waited until dawn to act. I didn't sleep. Instead, I opened the old file again, reviewed the clauses with eyes more alert than they'd been in months. I called the venue manager, a quiet man named Curtis, who had always treated me with courtesy, even long after I'd stopped visiting in person. His voice, gravelly and tinged with surprise, answered on the second ring. "Mr. Adler," he said, like someone hearing from a ghost. "Yes," I replied calmly, as if I were just calling to confirm a dinner reservation. "I need to cancel an event, the one scheduled for tonight. It's being hosted under the name of Vanessa Adler." There was a pause, the sound of a keyboard, a slight intake of breath. "That's your daughter-in-law, isn't it?" "Yes," I said again, "but she doesn't have the authority to use the venue without my approval. The lease allows me to override. I'm exercising that right. Terminate the contract. Shut it down." Curtis hesitated, but only briefly. "Of course, sir. I'll inform the vendors and staff." "Shall we notify the client directly?" I shook my head, even though he couldn't see it. "No. Let her find out when she arrives. I hung up, heart steady, hands firm. It wasn't malice that moved me. It was clarity. A boundary had been crossed, and I wasn't going to die sitting on the other side of it. I made 2 more calls, one to the head of the catering service, another to the rental company in charge of lighting and music. They were all under contracts I had personally negotiated years ago, with clauses still active, permissions that still ran through my name. One by one, each domino slid silently into place. Effective immediately, I told them. Return the equipment. Cancel the kitchen staff. Empty the venue by 5. There was confusion, protest, even a little disbelief. But legality always wins in silence. Paperwork, I've learned, is the final weapon of the invisible. By noon, I had confirmed that the decorations were being stripped down. The dance floor was gone. The sound system had been dismantled and loaded back into a van. The catering service, expensive and pretentious, had been rerouted to another event. The power was scheduled for cutoff by 4 p.m. The final touch, the parking permit filed under my business license, had been revoked. No cars would be allowed beyond the gated entrance. And still, not a word to Vanessa. I spent the rest of the afternoon in my armchair, the clock ticking softly above the door. The hum of the household grew louder as evening approached. I heard the occasional burst of laughter, the swish of garments, the clink of glassware being arranged. Vanessa had planned every detail to perfection. She had hired a photographer, a social media team, a florist known for extravagant arches that framed doorways like golden cages. I imagined her standing in the hallway, rehearsing her grand entrance. I imagined her looking around for her guests, for the DJ, for the wine display shaped like her initials. But the thing about illusions is they're only impressive until someone switches off the light. At 6:30, the shouting began. It came like a ripple, faint at first, then swelling. Vanessa's voice, sharper than ever, cut through the walls like broken glass. "What do you mean the venue's closed?" she shrieked. "Where's the caterer? Where are the tables? What do you mean you can't turn on the lights?" Every question hit the air like a match, igniting chaos. The staff scrambled, some already gone, others shrugging, pointing at emails and contract terms they couldn't explain. Aaron tried to intervene, but his words fell limp under her fury. Guests started arriving, only to be turned away at the gates by confused security guards with canceled badges. Instagram influencers in sequined dresses wandered the gravel path, bewildered, their ring lights flickering as the daylight faded. One by one, the pieces collapsed. From my window, I watched the porch lights flicker and die. The power had been cut. The house fell into darkness, not sudden but slow, like a curtain being drawn on a stage too proud to bow. Vanessa stormed outside, phone in hand, trying desperately to salvage what was already gone. Her face, once painted with confidence and control, now twitched with disbelief. I could see her mouthing accusations, spinning in circles, as if the world had betrayed her personally. She didn't look at the guest house. She didn't think to. In her mind, I had already left the story, but she was standing on my land, breathing in a world I built. When Aaron finally approached my door, hours later, his knock was timid. I opened it slowly, letting the light from my reading lamp spill into the hallway. His eyes were tired, his shirt untucked, the collar frayed like his nerves. "Did you?" he began, but the words failed. I nodded. "Yes," I said. "I did." He rubbed his face with both hands, somewhere between disbelief and exhaustion. "She's furious. She'll survive," I replied and sat back in my chair. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there for a long moment, as if trying to understand something he should have known all along. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. That night, the house was quiet. No music, no laughter, no hashtags, The only sound was the wind through the trees, soft and indifferent. I made myself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and watched as the last of the guests drove off into the night. Somewhere in the main house, I imagined Vanessa pacing, rewriting the narrative in her head, trying to salvage her image from the wreckage. But some stories don't get a second draft. Some stages collapse so thoroughly they never rise again. And me, I slept peacefully for the first time in months. I felt present, not needed, not thanked, just seen. There's a certain elegance in quiet revenge, the kind that doesn't arrive with thunder or a flame, but rather with the soft clicking of numbers on a telephone keypad. No threats, no shouting, just the unmistakable weight of finality hidden in a tone of calm authority. After Aaron walked away that night, leaving behind more silence than words, I sat alone in my room, letting the residue of their disaster settle in my mind like ash. I didn't gloat. That wasn't the point. The collapse of Vanessa's perfect night hadn't even started yet. What I had done so far was only prelude a single stone dropped into still water. The true ripples would begin with the next calls. I opened my small leather notebook, the same one I had used when I still managed logistics and schedules and supplier lists before I stepped out of my own story. It held numbers old, reliable numbers that hadn't changed, because the people I once worked with were not the sort who flitted through careers. They were men and women who respected signatures, who remembered faces, who recognized authority even when it whispered instead of roared. The first call I made was to the Energy Management Office. The contract for the venue's utility operations had always been handled through my holding company, a technicality Vanessa would never have thought to investigate. When the voice on the other end asked for my reference code, I read it from memory. I requested a temporary shutdown of the electrical grid to that specific property, citing non-compliance with owner terms as per Clause 17b. The agent confirmed it would take 3 hours for the cutoff to be processed. I thanked her and hung up. No electricity, no lights, no sound. The silence would arrive just in time for her grand entrance. Next, I called the catering service. It was a high-end provider, one I had helped launch years ago by investing in their original warehouse. The current owner, Lucinda, remembered me immediately. Mr. Adler. My God, it's been too long. I kept it brief. I told her the event scheduled under Vanessa's name had been submitted without proper authorization, and that the venue itself would no longer be operational that evening. She hesitated, clearly caught between client loyalty and the chain of command, but she knew me, knew that I didn't make calls like this unless it mattered. Do not deliver anything, I said. Hold the entire order, refrigerated or not. Nothing leaves your kitchen tonight. She agreed. And just like that, thousands of dollars in food, lobster tarts, miniature beef Wellingtons, imported cheeses, desserts flown in from somewhere equally unnecessary were detained. I pictured them, lined up in trays and silver carts, ready to be plated, but instead remaining behind stainless steel doors, untouched and slowly losing their intended meaning. The third call was to the custodial and maintenance staff, the team that handled last-minute floor polish, table setups, garbage disposal, and post-event cleanup. They were supposed to arrive by 5 p.m. to prepare the bathrooms, the dining hall, the entrance arch. I told their supervisor to stand down. The event has been terminated by ownership, I explained. Entry to the property will not be permitted. Ensure that no employees report for duty. He didn't ask many questions. These were working-class men, used to being redirected by people above their pay grade. But his tone shifted slightly when I said, "One more thing, and if anyone tries to access the back entrance, call me directly. My number is still listed under priority. 3 calls. 3 precise, clean strokes of a pen. The kind of quiet dismantling that leaves no mess behind, just absence." I didn't raise my voice, didn't curse Vanessa's name, didn't wish for her failure. I simply removed the scaffolding that held up her illusion. All I did was remind the system whose name was still etched at its base. Then I closed the notebook, placed the phone back in its cradle, and waited. The clock moved slowly after that. Every tick sounded louder than the last. Not because time had changed, but because the silence around it had. I brewed tea and sat in my usual chair. The same chair Vanessa used to roll her eyes at when she passed by. Always with that smirk. Still using that antique. As if comfort and worth had expiration dates. I looked out the window. Across the lawn, the big house was starting to stir again. People carried garment bags and wine crates. Someone was arranging flower arrangements on folding tables. I watched Vanessa step outside in a silk robe, her phone in one hand, gesturing wildly at someone on the other end of a call. She thought she was managing the event. She thought she was the architect. But every brick she laid stood atop a foundation I still owned. Around 2 o'clock, the first consequences began to arrive. A young man in a cap and branded apron jogged up to the house, breathless and confused. I recognized him as one of the delivery drivers from the catering company. Vanessa met him at the door, expecting trays. Instead, she received an apology. "Sorry, ma'am. We were told not to deliver. Everything's on hold." She asked for a reason. He didn't have one. "Someone high up," he said, and then backed away, awkward and nervous. She dialed someone else. I could see her face tighten through the glass, lips pulling into a snarl. Her arms flailed as she spoke. Then she froze. Something had dawned on her, maybe the first inkling that the air around her party was thinning. She vanished back into the house. By 3:30, a maintenance van arrived, only to circle the property and then disappear. The cleaning crew never showed. One of the decorators stood beside the driveway, arms crossed, talking furiously on the phone. She shook her head. Someone else dropped a box of votive candles and let them roll into the grass. I watched it all, not with satisfaction, but with precision. This was orchestration, not vengeance. It had to unfold correctly, at the right pace. Too fast, and it would burn out. Too slow, and the audience would leave before the finale. The magic was in the timing. Then, at 4:15, the lights flickered once. Then again. Then nothing. The windows of the main house dimmed. The hallway chandelier stopped glowing. Outside, the marquee lights lining the walkway blinked into silence. People peeked through curtains. A hum of confusion spread like steam. The generator hadn't kicked in. There was no backup. Vanessa emerged again, now visibly agitated, talking to a technician who kept shaking his head. She stormed toward the fuse box. It wouldn't open. She kicked it. She screamed. And I sat there, still, not gloating, just remembering how it felt to be told I was obsolete, that the celebration wasn't meant for people like me, that the world now belonged to them, to the youth, to the trendsetters and influencers and their curated little empires. But now her empire had no light, no food, no music, and no explanation. It would only get worse from here, because this was just the beginning. By the time the first car appeared at the edge of the long private road that led to the Adler event hall, the sun had begun its slow descent behind the pines, staining the sky with muted gold, as if the heavens themselves were preparing for something grand. The venue stood still, pristine in appearance, cold in spirit. Its white facade shimmered in the dying light, but inside it remained lifeless. No music filtered through the air. No laughter spilled from the doors. No perfume of roasted delicacies teased the senses. Just the weight of stillness, dense, expectant, almost theatrical. From across the narrow street, beneath the shade of a drooping maple, I sat motionless in my car, not hiding, just observing. A man in a charcoal coat sitting in a sedan older than the partygoers would bother to look at. But I watched. I watched. The guests arrived as I had predicted, one car after another, mostly European, freshly washed, some with chauffeurs, others with sons and daughters posing for social media as they stepped out in curated elegance. Women with polished heels and men with pressed suits. There was a certain rhythm to it, a practiced ease like a parade of prestige. They approached the front of the building expecting a grand welcome, as the invitation had promised, as Vanessa had no doubt bragged. But what greeted them was a locked glass door and silence. At first, the confusion was subtle, almost polite. A few exchanged glances. Some tried the door handles and then checked their phones, wondering if they had arrived early. The flower arch remained unlit, the walkway dim. The golden carpet laid out for the entrance had small leaves scattered across it, remnants from the wind, never brushed away by the cleaning crew that never came. A woman in a green silk gown tried peeking inside through the side windows. She saw nothing but darkness and empty tables. The murmurs began. Then came the phones, dozens of them, all rising at once like a nervous chorus. Calls made to Vanessa, to assistants, to catering managers. One man in an ivory blazer knocked 3 times, then banged. Another tried the service entrance. All locked, all dark, and soon people began to step back from the building, now unsure if they were the ones mistaken. Maybe the location changed. Maybe the event was postponed. The confusion was spreading, but it hadn't yet evolved into embarrassment. That would come soon, because now the more powerful guests were arriving investors, politicians, the very people Vanessa had designed this spectacle to impress. They stepped from their vehicles expecting immediate attention. Instead, they found a growing crowd of restless, overdressed bodies standing in clumps near the entrance, whispering about power outages and missing staff. The security hired for the evening was nowhere to be seen. The valet booth stood empty. No music, no champagne, no Vanessa. And then, like a queen too sure of her crown, she arrived. Her car, a silver luxury model, pulled up with unnecessary drama. She stepped out in a crimson gown, heels clicking against the pavement, face already sculpted into a practiced smile meant to disarm critics and woo potential allies. For a moment, she looked regal until the scene registered. The guests weren't inside sipping wine. They were outside sweating in their tuxedos, and all eyes had turned to her, searching for explanation. Her face cracked slightly, the first fracture in the porcelain mask. She looked at the locked doors, then at the silent venue, then back at her phone. She called someone, no answer. She gestured to a man beside her, probably an assistant, to check the back. He ran off. She stood still, blinking too fast, trying to suppress the tremble rising in her hands. The guests began approaching her now, gently but firmly, each with a variation of the same question. What's going on? Is this the right place? Why is the hall closed? Some smiled awkwardly, still trying to preserve the illusion that they weren't deeply annoyed. But the older ones, the donors, the board members, the types who didn't like their time wasted, began to step back. A few even turned to leave. Vanessa's voice, when she responded, was too loud, too desperate. It's just a mix-up. The staff must be delayed. Give us 10 minutes. But 10 minutes passed. Then 15. The sky darkened, and the lights never came on. At one point, a young woman approached with a clipboard, clearly a vendor, looking apologetic. "I'm sorry," she said to Vanessa. "We were told by management to suspend operations until further notice. Our truck was stopped at the back gate. They said the owner issued a halt." Vanessa's mouth opened and closed, unable to form anything useful. The clipboard girl stepped away. The assistant returned, panting, reporting that the back doors were locked and no staff had arrived. A few guests began pulling out car keys. One woman muttered, "I knew we should have gone to the Bransfields' dinner instead." Another said, "This is amateur." Vanessa stood frozen, trying to hold the center. but the center had already shifted. And from where I sat, across the street, I saw it happening, not just a failure of logistics, but the dismantling of status. The carefully layered image Vanessa had spent years crafting was peeling in the summer heat. Her friends were no longer her audience. They were her witnesses. They watched her fall, inch by inch, not with malice, but with that cold detachment reserved for fading stars. I saw her scan the crowd, eyes darting, looking for an anchor, for my son. But he hadn't arrived, and she didn't know that he wouldn't. Not yet. People began to leave in pairs, whispering excuses about traffic, about early mornings, about other plans. No one wanted to be seen lingering at a failed event. Reputation is a fragile currency, and tonight she had overdrafted hers. By the time the last of the cars pulled away, Vanessa was left standing near the locked glass door, alone but for her assistant, who was now avoiding her gaze. She didn't scream. She didn't sob. She just stood there, her hands still clutching her phone, as if praying that one more call might fix what was unraveling. And I started the car, slowly pulled away. My presence had never been necessary. She had already buried herself. I had only taken the shovel she left at my feet and handed it back to her. The silence that followed the dispersal of the guests was not empty, it was saturated with tension. An eerie, waiting quiet that clung to the air like smoke after a fire. Night had fully claimed the sky now, and the once radiant facade of the Adler Hall stood in solemn stillness, the locked doors like sealed lips refusing confession. Inside, though no one could see it yet, entropy was beginning its quiet work. In the back corridors, the freezer's great metallic chambers humming in dutiful chill just hours ago now sat lifeless, their circuits silenced by a single command made earlier that morning. I had dialed the number with precision, offered no explanation, and merely confirmed my authority. Cut the power, entire facility, no exceptions. And now, the consequences were blooming in secret, hidden in darkness but gaining strength by the minute. The flower arrangements exquisite, expensive, sourced from Holland and air-freighted just days before were arranged in the refrigerated floral holding room, waiting for their moment to shine. They would never get it. With the temperature rising steadily, their petals began to curl in protest, the delicate whites yellowing, the bold reds fading into bruised purples. Stems bent, the floral foam dried and cracked, and the air took on that unmistakable scent of death wrapped in perfume. In another chamber, the desserts suffered in silence. Glossy fruit tarts collapsed inward as their crusts lost structure. Chocolate sculptures softened into drooping shadows of their former grandeur. The Grand Piece Monty, an elaborate tower of eclairs and spun sugar, meant to be the centerpiece of the dessert table, stood sagging, its top already slanting like a melting crown. And the cake. Ah, the cake. It had taken for pastry chefs nearly 3 days to build it. For tears, custom sugar roses, hand-painted accents to match Vanessa's dress, edible pearls, and a secret raspberry champagne reduction in the base. It was, I'll admit, a thing of beauty too beautiful, perhaps, for what it was meant to celebrate. It now sat in the center of the catering refrigeration unit, once guarded like a treasure. But with the cooling disabled, and the hours ticking by, the fondant began to sweat, the structure began to tilt, and by the time someone would remember to check on it, the layers would have slumped into each other, the internal supports puncturing the delicate sides like bones breaking through skin. All of it, the flowers, the pastries, the canapes, the smoked salmon towers, the sculpted ice bowls for caviar, none of it would make it past midnight. The catering company, too, had received my call. A man named Gordon, whom I had once helped avoid bankruptcy during a bad winter 5 years ago, recognized my voice immediately. I didn't threaten. I simply requested, hold your delivery, postpone your departure. There's been a change. He asked no questions. Loyalty, like revenge, ferments best over time. So the trucks remained at the distribution site, engines off, drivers sipping coffee in confusion, while pallets of food began their slow decay. The foie gras sat sweating, the blinis grew damp, the shrimp turned. Vanessa, of course, didn't know any of this yet. She was still outside, scrolling through her phone, desperately redialing vendors who would not answer, trying to make sense of a collapse she couldn't control. She believed the worst had already happened, that the guests had left, that the lights had failed, that her carefully polished image had suffered a dent. She didn't realize she was still sinking, because reputations don't shatter all at once. They melt out slowly, imperceptibly, like ice turning to water in an unplugged freezer. The stain spreads gradually until everything it touches is ruined. And by the time you notice the floor beneath your shoes is slick, it's too late to stop the flood. At some point, her assistant, a thin, pale man with a clipboard and increasingly shaky hands, would remember to check the storage rooms. He would descend into the service corridors and find the coolers dark, the food warm, the air sour. He would open one stainless steel door and recoil from the stench of cheese gone bad, of wilted basil, of crab that had passed its threshold. He would call out for staff that wasn't there, and then he would run, the soles of his loafers slipping slightly on the wet tile, his breath quick, heart racing. He would find her pacing near the valet booth, still barking into her phone. He would whisper something to her, something urgent and ugly. Her face would go slack, and in that moment, she would realize that this was no coincidence. This was orchestration. Every missing piece, every silence, every delay, every door that refused to open had a hand behind it. And though she wouldn't say it aloud, not yet, a single question would burn behind her eyes. Was it him? She would remember my silence when she mocked me. She would remember my gaze. The way I didn't argue, didn't defend, just left, calmly, as if retreating wasn't surrender, but strategy. She would remember that I had owned the very building where she now stood stranded. In her mind, desperate to make sense of the chaos, would begin to trace the threads backward. Her voice would rise again, now tinged with panic. Check the contracts. She might scream. Who signed them? Who approved this? But by then, the guests who mattered had already driven away, unimpressed and inconvenienced. Their calendars were tight, their opinions sharpened by boredom and wealth were quick to sour. She would feel them slipping away, not just tonight but from her future. Invitations rescinded, meetings declined, doors gently closing. Because no one forgets the party where the lights failed, the drinks never came, and the host looked like a liar. And somewhere, in a small, dim office where the venue manager sat going over a checklist, a call would come in from corporate. A quiet voice would ask, "Has Mr. Adler been informed of the situation?" And the manager, unaware that I'd been watching everything unfold from the shadows of the city I helped build, would simply reply, "Yes, he was the one who authorized it." Vanessa's reputation, once polished, curated, envied, was now beginning to sweat, not in great floods, but in tiny, damning drops. The kind of sweat that ruins silk, the kind that makes eyeliner run, the kind that says to the world, "I am not in control. I am not who I pretended to be." And as the night deepened, and the scent of spoiled cream began to rise from the vents, and the melted chocolate formed a pool beneath the ruined cake, the truth would become inescapable. Her party had died in the womb. It was never meant to breathe, because the man she dismissed as irrelevant had never left the stage. He had simply stepped into the wings, waiting for his cue. The silence that followed the meltdown of the event did not signal an ending. It was merely a pause, a breath drawn by the orchestra before the final crescendo. In the lull, there was movement beneath the surface, invisible yet deliberate, like the slow turning of gears hidden behind an elegant facade. Somewhere in the depths of the Adler Hall, doors unlatched softly, and a pair of polished shoes stepped into the echo of disappointment. He walked without haste, his posture impeccable, the crisp fabric of his suit untouched by the chaos unfolding above. His name was Daniel Herrera, the general manager of the Adler Group's premier venues in the state, a man known not for his charisma but for the precision of his presence. No one among Vanessa's entourage had met him. No one had thought to ask who actually ran the building. They assumed the booking app, the concierge emails, and the transaction receipts were the extent of the structure. But Daniel didn't answer to apps or automated confirmations. He answered to a name few knew belonged on the top of the ownership ledger mine. As Daniel ascended the marble staircase, the weight of his authority did not need to be announced. It carried in the way heads turned when he passed, in the way even the security guards instinctively stepped aside. Vanessa was in the center of the lobby, fuming, her face blotched with frustration, her voice cracking with desperation as she barked into another phone call, perhaps the fifth in 10 minutes. Behind her, the air smelled faintly of sour sugar and flour decay. The overhead lights flickered not because of a fault, but because they were still running on backup circuits, a fact she had yet to realize. And then, as if summoned by the simmering pressure in the room, Daniel arrived, clipboard in hand, notepad tucked neatly beneath his arm, and approached her with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen better women reduced to apologies. "Mrs. Vanessa Adler?" he asked, his voice low but clear, syllables wrapped in velvet. She turned sharply, catching only the hint of his badge. "Who are you? Where the hell have you been?" she snapped, rage barely contained. Daniel didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. Instead, he took a slow breath and delivered the words like an obituary. "Per instruction from ownership, the event currently scheduled under your name has been administratively canceled. No further access to the main hall is authorized. We are obligated to escort all non-staff individuals off the premises within the hour." For a moment, the air in the room thickened. A hush, almost imperceptible, fell over the remaining staff and loitering guests. Vanessa's hand trembled slightly as she took a step forward. "Cancelled? By who? What the hell are you talking about? I paid for this place." Her voice was rising, shrill now, panic bubbling beneath the aggression. Daniel calmly retrieved the notepad, flipped it to a printed page marked with legal headers and authorization codes, and pointed to a signature at the bottom. Not hers, not the name of any event planner or venue staff. It was mine, printed and signed with the pen I had used for 20 years. "The building is owned and operated by Adler Holdings, Inc. Your reservation was made through a licensed third-party service, but per Clause 7. To be in the lease agreement, ownership reserves the right to revoke access under discretion, provided appropriate notice is filed. That notice was submitted this morning, signed, approved, and delivered." She froze, her mouth slightly open, words trapped between her teeth. "Adler Holdings," she murmured. "But my husband's family sold their shares years ago, I thought." And there it was, the fracture, the brief moment of cognitive dissonance when her carefully constructed version of reality collided with the silent architecture I had maintained beneath her feet. She never asked who retained the land titles. She never questioned who kept the emergency keys. To her, the Adler name was a brand to be worn, not a legacy to be understood. She had lived in the penthouse and never once inquired who paid the building's fire insurance. She assumed, as the proud do, that power was loud. But true control is quiet. It exists in documents, in signatures, in old friendships, and in the quiet knots exchanged between those who keep buildings standing while others throw parties in them. Vanessa's voice returned, brittle now. "Who authorized this?" Daniel tilted his head slightly, and with a faint motion, turned to the main doorway. Standing there, just inside the frame, wearing a charcoal gray suit and a tie I hadn't worn in years, was me. I didn't move. I didn't speak. But when Daniel gestured toward me and said, simply, He did. The room shifted. Eyes turned. Conversations died. Even the lights seemed to gather around me. Vanessa stared as if seeing a ghost. Her breath caught, and for a moment, the fury in her eyes gave way to something deeper recognition, not just of my face, but of what it represented. She had mocked me in public, stripped me of value with a single sentence, and now found herself standing ankle-deep in the ruins of a dream that had never belonged to her. The man she tried to erase with words had rewritten the script of her perfect evening. With a single gesture, she looked back at Daniel, searching for a lifeline, for a loophole, for some leverage. But Daniel was already checking his watch. "We will begin clearing the building in 20 minutes, he said. "Security has been instructed to assist with guest dispersal. Should you wish to file a grievance, the address is on the document." He handed her a second page, crisp and unbent, and with that, turned and walked away, his role complete. He never raised his voice, never offered explanation or apology, because he didn't answer to her. He answered to me, and when I nodded to him as he passed, he returned the nod and said, under his breath but clear enough for her to hear, "Good evening, Mr. Adler." There was no applause, no dramatic confrontation, just a quiet hum of lights returning to full power, the sound of doors unlocking on cue, and the slow realization that the party was over not because of an accident but because it had been orchestrated to end. Vanessa stood amid the remains of a dream she thought she controlled. But control, like respect, is not demanded. It is cultivated. And while she posed for cameras, I had built the stage. While she edited captions, I had signed the deeds. While she rehearsed insults, I had studied silence, and silence, when it finally speaks, leaves no room for rebuttal. There's a peculiar silence that follows the collapse of a celebration, a hush that is not quite peace but the stunned quiet of aftershocks rippling through reputations and relationships. It filled the grand corridor of Adler Hall, after Vanessa's party dissolved into a tableau of extinguished candles and scattered petals, each more wilted than the last. The clink of uneaten desserts being cleared, the soft rubber squeak of staff returning with utility carts, and the distant drone of vehicles arriving to collect guests, who now regretted RSVPing it all stitched together a new soundtrack, one she had never imagined. She was still standing near the grand staircase when her phone buzzed. Not the assistant's, not her husband's, but hers. Amid the embarrassment, she answered instinctively, a reflex like breathing or blinking, unaware that this was not a mistake but the next precise note in a carefully composed sonata of correction. Her eyes flicked to the screen, reading the name, a confused blink, and then she stepped aside, her stilettos wobbling slightly as if the floor no longer belonged to her. And in a way, it didn't. I had designed the architecture of this humiliation, not only to unravel her assumptions, but to reveal to her the contours of a world she never took time to understand. That message she received so perfectly timed, so impossible to ignore, was not sent in cruelty. It was an invitation, a gentle reminder that while she closed doors, others remained open, but only to those who knew how to knock. It came from an address she had never seen before, but the tone was unmistakably formal, gracious, and concise. "Mrs. Adler, we cordially invite you to a private dinner to honor the board transition of Adler Legacy Trust. Event to be held Friday, 7 p.m. sharp. RSVP required. Attire, formal. Guests will be vetted." There was no plea, no grand reveal, just an unassuming digital envelope containing a truth she hadn't expected. Something important was happening, and she wasn't in control of it. That was enough to plant a crack in the self-image she carried like armor. She read it again, silently mouthing the words, trying to decode them, but they were not encrypted. They were simply outside her lexicon. A transition dinner, a trust, a board, and yet it bore her name, or at least the name she'd borrowed through marriage. For years, Vanessa had treated the Adela name like a fashion accessory, stitching it into invitations, email signatures, and branded holiday cards. But tonight, the name had spoken back, and it had not asked her permission. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, is that the invitation wasn't random. It was sent precisely when the power had been restored, exactly 3 minutes after Daniel completed his report, and just as the security staff began escorting the last guests from the venue. She wasn't meant to attend, not really. The dinner was real, the board was real, the transition had been planned for months. But her name on the list was both a courtesy and a mirror. To see it there, adjacent to something she had no influence over, was to realize the limitations of performance. She had always performed status, wealth, control, but control is not a costume. It's not sequins and scripted greetings. It is a ledger, a voting seat, a signature on the bylaws of a family legacy. The kind of legacy she assumed had been absorbed into lifestyle. But legacy, unlike lifestyle, is rooted in memory. And I remembered everything. When Vanessa's father died, she buried him in a $9,000 coffin and didn't return to his gravesite once. When she married my son, she wore a custom gown flown in from Milan, yet forgot to invite my late wife's sister, my only living relative on her side. When my grandson was born, she made a spectacle of the baptism, complete with drone footage, but mispronounced the middle name we had chosen together to honor my father. These were not isolated slights. They were a pattern, a map of disregard etched into moments that should have brought families together. And while I bore them quietly, I never let them go, not to punish, but to prepare, because respect, like wine or patience, must be stored. And tonight, the bottle had been uncorked. As she stood frozen by the invitation, my son arrived to collect her. His face, pale and tired, betrayed that he knew something had shifted. Maybe he had known for years, but lacked the language or the courage to speak it aloud. He asked no questions. He placed a hand on her back, and together they walked toward the car. I watched them from the second-floor balcony, hidden by the shadows of columns older than both of them combined. I didn't feel triumph. I felt stillness, a kind of internal quiet that arrives only when justice is served without rage. The invitation had done more than humiliate. It had opened a door she didn't know existed. Whether she walked through it or closed it again will be her choice. But I wouldn't wait. By Friday, the dinner was set in a private room of the Orleans Club downtown, a place built on leather, whispers, and influence. 15 guests, silver flatware polished until it gleamed like reflection. I wore a black 3-piece suit, the same one from my wedding anniversary years ago. No name tags, no photographs, just recognition. The new board members had already begun arriving: an architect, a former judge, two historians, and my eldest friend, Harold, who once served as executor of my father's will. The menu had been curated by a chef who used to cook for diplomats. Wine imported from a vineyard I partially owned. I raised my glass and said only one sentence before dinner began. Tonight, we planned something that will outlive us all. And when the doors were closed, I noticed that one seat, Vanessa's, remained untouched. She hadn't responded to the invitation, not by email, not by letter, and that silence was, in its own way, the loudest thing she'd ever said. I respected that. She had chosen pride over curiosity, and in doing so, she'd confirmed everything the evening had been designed to reveal. She didn't belong in that room, not because of who she was, but because she never cared to know how that room had been built. You cannot inherit what you ridicule. You cannot sit at a table you pretend doesn't exist. And as dessert was served, I quietly instructed Daniel to send one final message, just 6 words. The seat is no longer available. It wasn't revenge. It was acknowledgement. A ledger closed. A door sealed. The beginning of a legacy not defined by arrogance or exclusion, but by care, memory, and the relentless pursuit of dignity and silence. There's a particular moment in every unraveling where silence stops being a choice and becomes a signal, where the hum of humiliation gives way to something more dangerous: public attention. For Vanessa, that moment didn't come with a shout or a final blow of argument. It came hours after the disaster, when she was still trying to paste together the illusion of control, with manicured fingers shaking over her phone. Her makeup was smeared from stress and sweat, her heels long discarded somewhere beneath a folding chair, and her designer clutch now useless in a place that no longer respected design. She had locked herself inside the car that brought her to the event, and hadn't dared return to the ruined ballroom. It was there, in that stale leather seat, that the notification came. 1 ping, then 5, then 23. She opened her phone expecting pity, maybe condolences disguised as compliments. But what she found was far more potent. It was a video, just 45 seconds long, grainy, vertical, clearly captured from a hidden angle. In it, Vanessa's voice rang out, unmistakable and sharp, speaking directly to the man whose silence had built the ground she stood on. "It's not for old people, okay?" The voice echoed from her own lips, over and over, as the clip played again and again on the feed of a growing audience. Her expression was caught in brutal clarity, dismissive, performative, and completely unaware of the world watching from the other side of the screen. The comments came faster than she could read them. "Wait, that's her father-in-law. She said this to him. Bro owns the building, doesn't he? Some were cruel, others surgical in their precision." Someone had found a photo of me, a candid shot from years ago, taken at a community charity dinner where I had quietly donated the entire food budget for the following year. That image sat beside a freeze frame of Vanessa's dismissive hand waved from the video. Side by side, the contrast needed no caption. The internet had smelled blood, but more than that, it had sensed a story. And stories, once ignited, are harder to control than fire. By dawn, the video had crossed platforms, from TikTok to Instagram, then to Reddit threads and local news outlets. The caption varied slightly from post to post, but the message was clear. This woman insulted the man who funded her entire social performance. And now, she was finding out that the people she tried so hard to impress loved justice more than they loved money. That was the thing about reputation. You could build it over years with photo shoots and curated brunches and gala invitations. But you could lose it in 45 seconds if the person you stepped on had the patience to wait. What no one knew, what only I knew, was that the video had been captured not by accident but by quiet design. I never intended it to go viral. I only wanted a record, proof that, in a moment of truth, she had chosen to embarrass rather than embrace. That camera had been installed for security months ago, embedded discreetly near the entrance, part of a system she had ignored completely. It was set to overwrite footage every 30 days. But after that comment, after the look in her eyes, as she said it, I had quietly downloaded and stored that file. Not to blackmail, not to threaten, just to preserve. And when the evening of the party collapsed, under the weight of her own negligence, I gave Daniel the simplest instruction. If she posts anything denying what happened, upload the clip. She did. A single Instagram story, 2 hours after the failed party, with a message that read, "Some people can't handle strong women, but we rise." The moment I saw it, I nodded. No anger, no revenge, just confirmation. A lie had been spoken, so the truth would speak louder. And it did. Louder than she could have imagined. Influencers she once invited for PR appearances began deleting posts that had her tagged. Sponsors from a wellness brand she had courted stopped responding to her emails. Her inbox, once a flood of collaborations and curated invitations, slowed to a trickle. And still, she refused to apologize, because apology would have meant acknowledgement. An acknowledgement would have forced her to look at me not as an inconvenience, but as the architect of the very foundation she pretended to stand above. But the internet didn't wait for apology. It rarely does. Instead, it carved a narrative of its own. They called me the silent legend, the real patriarch, the man who watched it all burn with class. I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because the truth had already done the heavy lifting. My phone buzzed just once that week. It was a message from a girl I didn't know, maybe 17 or 18. "You remind me of my granddad. He passed last year. He never raised his voice, but when he stood up, people listened. Thank you for showing us what quiet strength looks like." I didn't reply, but I saved the message. Some things are better kept than shared. Meanwhile, Vanessa spiraled. Her attempts to regain control became more desperate. She tried turning the narrative into one of ageism awareness ironic. Given her words, she posted filtered videos about miscommunication and family tension. None gained traction because the original video, raw, unfiltered, and damning, was too strong to dilute. And then, the worst thing that could have happened to someone like her happened. The silence returned, but this time, it wasn't the silence of respect. It was the silence of irrelevance. Her name faded from the algorithm. Engagement plummeted. Invitations stopped. And through it all, I remained where I had always been, invisible to those who never looked beyond the surface, but unforgettable to those who understood the long game. This wasn't about destroying her. It never was. It was about reminding her and everyone watching that sometimes the loudest message comes not from shouting or revenge, but from restraint. The kind of restraint that waits years for a single moment of reckoning. The kind that lets the world connect the dots on its own. Because the truth doesn't need to be explained. It only needs to be revealed. And once revealed, it becomes irreversible. The silence that followed was not the kind that descends after noise, but the kind that rises after revelation. It crept through corridors and text threads, whispered its way through living rooms and offices, and lingered in spaces once filled with curated laughter. The world had seen the moment. It had judged it without my permission and handed down a verdict not in words, but in absence. Vanessa's world, built on appearances, maintained through partnerships, sustained by control, had begun to rot from within. And she couldn't sweep fast enough to hide the stench. But the part she never anticipated, the collapse she couldn't factor into her damage control spreadsheets, came not from strangers or followers or business partners. It came from the only person who had once believed her veneer was skin deep, my son. For years, he had lived in the in-between between loyalty and denial, between silence and enabling. He had seen her sharpen her smile like a blade before every family dinner. He had heard the small dismissals, the cold calculations, the way she rewrote the past in real time to suit her narrative. He had defended her, perhaps even to himself, because love makes excuses long after dignity has stopped listening. But when the clip went viral, when the world pointed not at her, but at me, when people whispered, "Isn't that his father?" something inside him shifted, something that had waited quietly for its moment to surface. He didn't say anything for 3 days. I knew, because I had expected that delay. My son was a man who thought before he moved. He did not explode. He absorbed, and the longer he absorbed, the less he returned. On the 4th day, I found him waiting outside my house, not with anger or embarrassment, but with something far heavier, clarity. He didn't knock. He simply sat on the front steps, as he had done as a boy when his mother used to call him in for dinner. I opened the door, and he looked up, not at the porch, not at the street, but directly at me. "I saw the video," he said. "I saw the comments. I saw the truth." I didn't respond, because I knew it wasn't a conversation. It was a confession. A slow dismantling of the denial he had held like a crucifix against the growing rot of his marriage. He continued, his voice low but steady. "She told me it was nothing. that people were taking it out of context, that you misunderstood her. But the look in your eyes in that video, I've never seen that before. And I realized something. You weren't hurt because of what she said. You were disappointed because I stood there and didn't say anything. That, more than anything, was the wound he came to name. Not the words he said, but the silence he kept. He had betrayed not my pride, but my patience. For years, I had waited, not for an apology, not for redemption, but for recognition. The simple acknowledgement that I had not become obsolete, simply because I had stepped aside. He looked down at his hands and then said what no father ever expects to hear from a grown son, especially one who had once made his own name by stepping out of his father's shadow. I'm ashamed. Of her, of myself, and I don't want to keep choosing pride over decency. It wasn't dramatic. There were no tears. Just a man folding the map he had followed blindly for too long. He stood up and placed a small envelope in my hand. It was a letter handwritten, addressed to Vanessa. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The weight of it was not in its content but in its finality. I'm leaving, he said. She doesn't know yet, but I won't stay in a house where contempt is served as etiquette. And I won't raise our daughter to think this is what strength looks like. That last line struck me deeper than any slap could have, because it meant he had seen the real consequence, not just the social fallout, but the legacy. What gets passed down, silently, through dinners and birthdays and unspoken rules. What children see in the way their parents treat the people who raised them. He walked back to his car, without looking back, not because he was angry, but because the choice had already been made. And choices, when born of truth, do not ask for applause. That night, I sat alone in my study, the same room where I had once read him bedtime stories, where I had drafted the paperwork that gave him his first loan, where I had listened quietly when he told me he was in love. I sat there not with triumph, but with a strange ache, a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. I had lost much in silence, but I had never lost him. I only needed him to remember who I was before the world told him who I wasn't. Across the city, Vanessa found the letter on her pillow. I would later hear from one of her former friends that the screaming went on for hours, that she called everyone she knew, trying to spin a narrative, trying to find anyone who would agree that she had been wronged. But no one answered, not because they were avoiding the drama, but because they had already chosen their side. Not mine, but the side of dignity. She had mocked it, and now she stood alone in its absence. That was the moment the league unraveled, not with fireworks, but with phone calls not returned, messages left unread, invitations that never came again. People didn't abandon her out of cruelty. They simply backed away from the smell of scorched grace. And my son, for the first time in years, began showing up. 2 dinners, 2 weekends, 2 moments that once felt forced and now felt necessary. He didn't bring explanations. He brought presents. And his daughter, my granddaughter, began asking about the old stories again. The ones her father used to tell her about a quiet man who built everything without needing to say he did. She looked at me one day, her eyes too bright for her age, and said, "Mom says you're too old for TikTok. But everyone at school says you're the coolest grandpa ever." I laughed, not because I cared about being cool, but because it meant the narrative had shifted. Not by force, not by revenge, but by truth allowed to breathe. The silence inside the abandoned hall had a weight to it, as if the very air had thickened in mourning for something that was never born. A celebration aborted in pride's womb. A ceremony meant not to honor love or family, but to impress and exclude. The lights that never flickered on left shadows stretched across the tiled floors, long and accusing. Wilted flowers leaned against chairs still bound in gold ribbons, but no guests sat upon them. No laughter bounced off the walls. No clinking glasses toasted empty declarations. The hall had become a mausoleum, not of death but of vanity. And in the center of it sat Vanessa, still in her designer dress, its fabric now wrinkled at the waist, her hair once sculpted now slightly collapsed at the crown, and her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and exhaustion. The high heels she'd worn with such certainty at noon had been discarded by 6, and her bare feet curled against the cold floor, as if grounding herself could undo the events that had unraveled so thoroughly. Outside, the night had drawn a curtain across the city, and not a single car remained in the parking lot. Not a friend, not a photographer, not even her husband. The guests, once handpicked to elevate her image, had followed the scent of authenticity to the quieter venue across town, where laughter did not need champagne to exist, and where my voice calm, steady had told stories that didn't need embellishment. They had eaten from simpler plates and drank from ordinary glasses, and in their eyes, I had seen something I hadn't in years, remembrance, not of what I had done but of who I had been, and that had been enough. Back in the empty hall, Vanessa's phone buzzed occasionally, an echo of the world that once orbited around her, but none of the notifications were messages of comfort. Just likes evaporating into silence, just tags and threads that didn't invite her participation. She scrolled through photos taken before the collapse, still clinging to the fantasy that maybe this could be salvaged. But her eyes kept returning to one viral clip, paused on a single frame, her own face twisted in impatience, saying the words she now could not unsay. It's not for old people, okay? The comment section no longer brimmed with heart emojis and praise. Instead, it was filled with fragments of truth from strangers. Who speaks to their father-in-law like that? No wonder the party failed. Respect is the new luxury. She tried replying to a few, defending herself, then deleting, then blocking. But the internet has no backspace, only receipts. She stood up, finally, but her knees wobbled, as if even they hesitated to carry her forward. Each step across the dance floor felt longer than the last. The DJ booth, untouched. The bar, untouched. The centerpiece of her ambition, untouched by anything except dust and disappointment. She found a half-empty bottle of water near the back wall and drank it slowly, as if hoping to wash the bitterness out of her throat. But taste does not live on the tongue alone. It roots in the soul. At home, I returned to my chair, not with a sense of victory, but with the exhale of a man who no longer had to explain himself. The fireplace crackled faintly. My granddaughter had fallen asleep on the couch, her shoes still on, a crayon still in her hand, and beside her lay a simple drawing me, her, and her father at a table, smiling. Above us, in her clumsy lettering, the words, "The real party." I smiled. Not because it was poetic, but because it was accidental truth. And children are the last to lie before they learn how. My son came in quietly. He placed a folded jacket over his daughter and sat across from me. No words, just the presence of a man who had rediscovered his anchor. We watched the fire in silence, both knowing that some endings do not require discussion, only stillness, only the slow undoing of false beginnings. And Vanessa, I imagine she sat there long after the lights were turned off manually by a janitor who didn't know her name. I imagine she walked home, heels in hand, makeup smeared slightly at the corners of her eyes, not from tears, but from the rubbing that comes when someone keeps trying to erase a moment they can't. The next day, she would post a photo cropped, filtered, captioned with something vaguely empowering. Not everything goes as planned, but queens adjust their crowns. But the likes would be fewer, the comments polite but generic. The invitations would stop coming, not out of cruelty, but out of consequence, because reputation, once inflated beyond humility, deflates quickly under pressure, and respect, once lost, rarely returns to the same door. As for me, I didn't need revenge. I never wanted it. What I wanted was what every quiet man who has lived a full life in the background wants: to be seen without shouting, to be valued without demanding, and to be remembered not for what he ruined, but for what he refused to destroy, even when given every reason. And in that empty house, with a fire flickering and a granddaughter breathing softly on the couch, I realized something. I hadn't won. I had survived, with dignity intact, and sometimes that is the most satisfying victory of all.